Senate Bill 1252, the Defend the Guard Act, brings the state of Idaho into alignment with Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution by prohibiting the Idaho National Guard, the state's militia, from being deployed into active duty combat unless Congress first declares war. Congress has the sole authority to declare war, and this authority was carefully vested in the deliberative body and not in the executive, as the executive is the branch of government most prone to wage war. Our branches of military service and our National Guard have long and proud military histories. However, the decision to send young men and women overseas to risk life and limb cannot be taken lightly. The cost of war is great, and both wounds, seen and unseen, remain with us forever. This deliberate action was and still should be weighed in the chambers of Congress and not delegated away to the executive branch and subsequently to the administrative state or the bureaucracy of Washington, D.C. I doubt you will find any resistance to the idea that the governor is the commander-in-chief of the Idaho National Guard. It is stated clearly in Article 4 of our state constitution. He holds no war-making authority, and the passage of this legislation empowers his position over our state's militia to ensure that when called into federal service, they are only used in accordance with the supreme law of the land, the United States Constitution. Article 2 establishes the President as the Commander-in-Chief of the state's militia only when called into actual service, and the term actual service is enumerated to suppress insurrection, repel invasion, and enforce the laws of the Union. Congress is the lawmaking body of the Union, and the usurpation of this final enumeration by the executive is why this legislation is before us today. Mr. President, there has been no public opposition to Senate Bill 1252, only whispers, and I'd like to bring those out of the shadows. There were three primary concerns brought up during the crafting of this legislation, and I intend to refute them all before you today. First, that if overseas missions are limited by this legislation, the Idaho National Guard could be defunded. Section 108 of Article 32 U.S. Code authorizes forfeiture of funds when a state fails to comply with the requirements of Title 32. The code sections that authorize the executive to activate the National Guard into active duty combat is located in Title 10 U.S. Code. Title 32 specifically notes that Congress has the authority to call up the National Guard and limits its matters to national security. This raises a barrier to the possibility that Congress would ever deny funding to our National Guard or any National Guard that would refuse to accede to their deployment to active duty combat absent a congressional declaration of war. Congress holds the purse strings, and a member of our own congressional delegation is the third highest ranking member on the Appropriations Committee in Congress. You will not see him or any member of Congress defund their respective states' National Guard. More broadly, this concern over funding highlights a very real issue that this legislation seeks to remedy: a usurpation of authority from Congress. Additionally, relating to the withholding of funds, I ask a simple question. I want a name. Give me the name of the bureaucrat who says our National Guard will be defunded. It's not our Adjutant General. In this case, he is the messenger. In any case, there is a congressional subcommittee on the weaponization of the federal government, and they are just dying to meet them. The second concern asserts, and accurately so, that Congress routinely now authorizes the President's use of military force by means other than a declaration of war, and that a governor cannot object. Not only does this fly in the face of the state's authority over its own militia, but it is this routine abdication of congressional authority that highlights the necessity of this legislation. Several sections under Title 10 of U.S. Code address the authority to transfer state National Guard units to active federal duty. Section 12301A states that active duty may be initiated in a time of war or of national emergency declared by Congress, or when otherwise authorized by law. This legislation will make it the policy of the state of Idaho that the provision, or when otherwise authorized by law, is an evasion of the constitutional responsibility that Congress declare war under Article 1, Section 8, and is therefore unconstitutional. This is significant legislation. I want to make sure everyone's informed. Subsection B of that same section of Title 10 U.S. Code requires the consent of a governor for mobilizing the State National Guard. However, it has been argued that Section B is apparently superseded by subsection F, known as the Montgomery Amendment, which provides the governor, or prohibits a governor from withholding consent based on the location, purpose, type, or schedule of active duty. In fact, the proposed legislation has nothing to do with the governor withholding consent. Instead, this is a legislative prohibition, and if enacted, state law, prohibiting the mobilization of our National Guard for overseas combat absent of a declaration of war. The Montgomery Amendment to Title 10 has been cited as justification for the broad definition that is utilized today and was narrowly upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court 40 years ago, but only as it pertains to the National Guard's mobilization for training purposes during peacetime. The court did not opine on the objective of this proposed legislation to prohibit deployment of our National Guard to active combat duty overseas during a time of undeclared war. So while Congress has routinely used authorizations of military force over the last 80 years, the courts have not tested the question of whether deployment of the National Guard to active duty combat can be limited to congressional declarations of war. I believe that our current Supreme Court, based on court rulings in the last 4 years, might take a much stricter view regarding the principle of compliance with the original intent of the Constitution. This is a decision for the courts to rule on and not bureaucrats and political appointees. In the relevant case, Perpich v. Department of Defense, the court summarized that the question presented is whether Congress may authorize the President to order members of the National Guard to active duty for purposes of training outside of the United States during peacetime without either the consent of a state governor or a declaration of a national emergency. So to clarify and repeat, the court has not prohibited a state from requiring that the deployment of its National Guard to active duty combat during a time of active military conflict must be preceded by a congressional declaration of war. Since the passage of the 2001 AUMF, Authorizational Use of Military Force, no member of the House of Representatives in Congress has voted on the issue. Over 2 decades. And due to the turnover in Congress, most members have never voted on that authorization at all. The pages have handed out several documents for you to review, including the 2001 Authorizational Use of Military Force, which has been the justification for utilizing our National Guards in undeclared wars over the last 23 years. It specifically targets those who took part in the 2001 terrorist attacks and authorizes the President to pursue them with the full force of the United States military. An understandable response, Mr. President. 9/11 was a huge reason that I and a whole generation of patriotic Americans chose to serve. We wanted to hunt down those that did our country harm. I vividly remember hearing the news that Osama bin Laden had been killed. It was a good day for America. I had already deployed once to Afghanistan and was preparing to deploy again. And I remember going up to my senior enlisted officer and stating, "Well, we got them all. Everyone who had anything to do with the attack on 9/11 is either dead or captured. So the deployment's off, right? We won this war." Little did I understand at the time that Congress's abdication of their war powers meant that the funding would keep rolling. And not only would I lose 3 Marines on the following deployment, but we would be there in Afghanistan for another 9 years. This is the same authorization that was used to send our own Idaho National Guard in 2023 to Syria, an active combat zone. According to our own State Department, and Mr. President, may I request a quote from the State Department website?
Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you. There is no military solution to the Syrian conflict, end quote. Do you imagine that this is what our founding fathers intended? That one authorizational use of military force would stand as an eternal blank check to the executive branch, especially given the statements by the founders expressly to the contrary over 2 centuries ago. Third, that somehow this legislation would require our nation's largest bureaucratic agency, the Department of Defense, to realign its force structure to continue its undeclared wars abroad, and that our National Guard and any state that stands for the original intent of the Constitution would risk losing their National Guard units. Again, Mr. President, I want a name. I want to know who the source of these paper tiger threats is, to keep our nation in a state of perpetual war without a congressional declaration of war. For the record, we are undefeated in declared wars. Our last one was World War II. I'll let you decide about the rest. Congress holds the purse strings. I was asked why Congress hasn't declared war in 80 years. That's a great question. There is a lot of money to be made in war. And the war industry happens to live right next door with a lot of access to our Congress. Eisenhower, one of our nation's greatest generals and the President of the United States, warned in his farewell address, and Mr. President, to quote from President Eisenhower's farewell address.
Go ahead, Senator.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Well, it exists, and it has persisted. I'm convinced that Congress must reclaim their war powers. We can't do that for them. But the Defend the Guard Act emboldens the United States Congress to do just that while fulfilling our obligation and our responsibility to our oath. Every service member and everyone in this room swore this: I do hereby solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I did not swear an oath to defend and support the force structure of the bureaucratic state, nor to support and defend the military-industrial complex. Neither did you, Mr. President. Debate is open.
Is there further debate?
Mr. President, to debate the bill.
Senator Taves, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senators, I rise in support of Senate Bill 1252. The Constitution is clear. Only Congress has the authority to declare war. And this legislation will encourage them to do their duty. We need a reassessment of how our National Guard is being utilized. This year, we've witnessed our governor engage in the efforts of Texas to stop an invasion on our southern border. Idaho sent a few brave Idaho State patrolmen to assist while other states sent members of their National Guard. To repel an invasion is one of the 3 literal purposes of the National Guard. Should our National Guard be serving in Syria and guarding oil wells, or should they be on our southern border repelling an invasion? Today isn't the time to debate the merits of one mission over the other, but the Constitution is quite clear that one is the defined purpose of the National Guard, while the other has not received proper authority. Should the National Guard fight America's wars? Absolutely. But Congress must declare war before the Idaho National Guard is called into federal service for the purpose of fighting a war in a foreign country. No other criteria should be the focus of this discussion. Instead of focusing on all the reasons to continue ignoring the enumerated powers identified in the Constitution, we should lean on our authority over the federal government. The 10th Amendment is our ultimate authority when the federal government does not act in furtherance of the Constitution. I believe this bill is a necessary step in the right direction. The National Guard has more important duties than fighting multi-decade wars with no strategy and no congressional sanction. I encourage you to vote yes.
Is there further debate? Further debate.
Mr. President.
Senator Schroeder.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is hard. It's probably the hardest debate that I've ever prepared for. A dear friend, my colleague from District 12, has been chatting with me about this topic for a long time, and it's very near and dear to my heart. I couldn't agree more. Congress has shirked, relinquished, abdicated, sat back, twiddled its thumbs for its constitutional duty as the sole authority to declare war. That's crystal clear.
Yes.
They have not done it. They refuse to do it. Every candidate for Congress I've encountered on the campaign trail, I've asked him, when are you going to step in and assert your authority to declare war? Oh, and you get the typical, we know what it sounds like. End of February 2004, every member of the Idaho Army National Guard got the phone call that we've been training for since the time we've been in, a raging bull, which means an actual activation. This is it. You're going to go to war. At that time, I was a recruiter in Mountain Home. I'd enlisted probably 18 or 20 people, members of my community, who I knew were going to face being deployed to Iraq. We went there. I drove 600 miles across Iraq. I was in a hangar with the Secretary of Defense, and I was there when he told us, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you wished you have, regarding how much armor we did or didn't have on our vehicles. I spent 5 days on the rooftop of an Iraqi police station watching people vote for the first time in Iraq, their first free and fair elections. And I thought, this is good. We're helping these folks. Was the original invasion in Iraq, was the whole thing a complete debacle, insufficiently staffed? Absolutely. Does the Secretary of Defense and Commander-in-Chief of the Army, of the military at that time, hold culpability for that? Absolutely. IEDs aren't things you made up in a washing machine, parts, or cell phones. They were artillery shells that were stolen out of Saddam's gigantic stockpile. And those people got them because we didn't go there with a big enough fighting force, because people didn't want it to look like an invasion. I carried a casket, an ice-filled chest, containing my friend Virgil Case, onto a C-130 for transport home. I have watched a mother at a ramp ceremony at Gowan Field break ranks and run across the tarmac and hurl herself over the casket containing her son. I've handed a flag to the mother of a child who died in combat. The month before we were supposed to return from Iraq, the Iraqis were going to vote on their constitution. We were out in the city again, guarding a government building in anticipation of the insurgent activity or whatnot. But I happened upon a copy of the Iraqi Constitution, and if I may read, Mr. President.
Go ahead.
First, Islam is the official religion of the state and is a foundation source of legislation. No law may be enacted that contradicts the established provisions of Islam. No law may be enacted that contradicts the principles of democracy, and so forth. And I remember reading that thinking, what the hell did we accomplish? The Iranians couldn't have written that any better. What good was it? What did we accomplish? Then I returned after the deployment, and I became a recruiting supervisor. I was in charge of 12 recruiters from Mountain Home to Burley. And I remember thinking, I don't think it's our job to sell this conflict. It's our job to tell people they can join the service, and they certainly risk being sent and being deployed. So I don't think anyone in this room understands, well, I don't want to put words or thoughts in anyone's mind, but this hits close to home. And I couldn't agree more. If you're going to give up your life, it should be for a good reason. Clearly, there's accidents that happen, and there's nothing you can do about it. Loss of life is tragic. But when you're going to expend all these resources, disrupt people's lives, disrupt their communities, their marriages, it sure should be for something really, really important. And I've seen the Idaho Guard deploy in times, and I questioned the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who was visiting Boise. What's this one for? I get the 2004 deployment, but what are we doing now? I couldn't agree more with the sentiment of this bill, but I have a grave concern about its practical effect. This bill is rearward looking. This bill looks back at the mistakes we've made in allowing the Guard to be deployed. This bill looks backward and says, Congress, you shouldn't have done that. Congress, you shouldn't have let the executive branch have this ability to deploy our Guardsmen anywhere you see fit, to little places like Syria and so forth. But what this bill doesn't do is look forward at things we can't anticipate. And it doesn't incorporate some history and experiences that the Idaho National Guard has had in the past. So, Idaho National Guard is part of the National Defense Act, and they have been amended in 1903 and 1916 and 1920 to integrate the Army National Guard with the whole defense package. So, Idaho Guard units from our local communities, Weiser, Grangeville, Twin Falls, Pocatello, Burley, they've all deployed. The unit I joined, the 116th Engineer Battalion in Moscow, was in every conflict, from 1898 in the Philippines, 1916 action on the Mexican-American border in Nogales, Arizona, 1917 World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, and Iraqi freedom. Those units were supplied and equipped and trained using the resources of the federal government and the manpower of Idaho citizens. Idaho citizens rallied together. We want to have an armory in our town. They would supply some money to build one. The federal government provided the force structure. In the 30s, Idaho Guard was getting rid of horses, and they needed trucks, they needed vehicles. And so as a result of the National Defense Act, the federal government provided all of the equipment and all of the pay for all of our soldiers to train on Thursday nights. It became sort of a social club, but they would have to train. They would do summer camps in Boise, but they had to train to be ready to be deployed. And every time that call came, they were ready, and they did so. In the early 1990s, the Idaho National Guard became a roundout brigade for the 4th Infantry Division. There was a huge sea change in the way that Idaho National Guard trained. We were constantly beset by evaluators from the 4th Infantry Division. Our summer camps were no longer merely 2 weeks. They started on a Friday, and it was intense. As a result of all of that, as a result of that allocation of resources, as a result of the allocation of equipment and tons of money and good training, difficult training, exhausting training, every one of those soldiers was ready when the call came in 2004. Every piece of equipment that the brigade headquarters company had drove from the middle of Kuwait to Kirkuk, 618 miles. As a result of our being part of our nation's defense system. Had this bill been in place in 1940, in 1940, the federal government and the president recognized that the situation in Japan and in Europe was getting very, very dire. The president ordered the mobilization of National Guard units across the country for intensive training in order to be ready in case a conflict occurred. Mr. President, if I may read from Chapter 6 of the history of the Idaho National Guard.
You have permission to read.
Thank you. September 3rd, 1940, Governor Clarence Bottleson responded to a telegram from the Secretary of War ordering all National Guard units of the 41st Division into active service. These were from Coeur d'Alene, Boise, Bonners Ferry, Payette, St. Mary's, Sandpoint, Lewiston, and Moscow. The Engineer Regiment from Boise, Idaho Falls, Burley, Pocatello, Twin Falls, Buell, and Rigby. Headquarters Company from Blackfoot, and the Ordnance Company from Jerome. Later, more units were ordered. I won't go into reading those here. But all those units were ordered into active duty in 1940. By the end of 1940 and going into 1941, finally the situation was so dire that those units, highly trained and ordered into active federal service by the federal government, were deployed overseas to the Philippines, and war was not declared until December 8th, 1941. Had this bill been in place, all of those soldiers would have had to sit here and wait, not having received any of that training, but would have been mobilized and then later sent to training much later in the war. That's not really my main objection. That's one, and I think it's a serious one. But the fact is, for all of Idaho's history, the Idaho National Guard has been part of a national force structure and has been able to respond not just to national emergencies, but to Idaho's emergencies. The equipment that the federal government supplies us is used to clean up dams, to clean up mine tailings, to do active service in snow removal, floods, all manner of things. We use that equipment as part of a bargain. The federal government says, here's all this equipment, we're going to need it when we come to train, we're going to need it when we have to call you to war, but until then you can use it. So what happens when this bill passes? They're not going to defund the Guard. I get that. That's absolutely correct. They don't have the ability, they don't have the authority to do it. But what will happen, what absolutely will happen, is the people at the Department of Defense who are trying to shape the national force structure in anticipation of threats and conflicts that we cannot today predict are going to say, okay, well, there's a state that we're not going to have assets available to mobilize in case we need to get started ahead of time. So let's just assume that Congress gets its stuff together and doesn't do something, absolutely does a declaration of war. This hamstrings us from being able to participate in the prelude to that conflict. And it means that the Idaho National Guard is going to be allocated differently than it would if it was able to participate. What does that exactly mean? I don't know. You can make, I make the extreme example, which I have said to the good senator from 12, great, you don't want to play? You're going to be a postal unit. Here's 17 file cabinets and a fax machine. I don't think it's that drastic, but I think you can see that not just the equipment, the helicopters, the aviation assets, the bulldozers, the dump trucks, but the training. That training that we were put through and all of the money to pay for that training by the federal government was essential to our ability to succeed in Iraq. It saved lives. It saved a lot of lives because you didn't have to start over with, here's a rifle. This book is replete with history of how we go to a conflict, we get done with the conflict, we come back, and the whole Idaho National Guard reorganizes. The national command structure says, okay, we're going to reallocate these resources from here to here, and then they emerge reorganized. The effect of this bill, the practical effect of this bill, it's my belief, will be that we don't get a seat at the table, talk to the National Guard Bureau or to the Department of Defense about what assets will remain in Idaho. Oh, you don't want to do it? Great. Duly noted. We'll let you know what we end up with as the end of this. I really hope that one of these days Congress asserts its constitutional sole authority to declare war. And I think we need to really, really send a message to them to do that. But I think this has an unintended consequence that's dangerous and that I think affects an organization that I spent 21 years in, that I've shed tears over. Organization, it's probably one of the best things that's ever happened to me, that I love. My brothers in arms in that organization run from boundary to boundary of this state. And so with that, Mr. President, I'll be voting no, but I'll be asking my colleagues here to please vote your conscience, whatever that is. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Is there further debate?
Mr. President, to debate the bill.
You have the floor, sir.
I have to admit I came to the floor today with my mind made up as to how I was going to vote on this bill. But over the course of a 30-year military career, I worked with Guard units for probably half of that time. And towards the latter half of my career, I saw Guard units activated and put on Title 10 orders, which means there's really no distinction between active duty Air Force and Air National Guard. Your chain of command goes right to the President, and you're controlled and operated by an active duty chain of command, actually. And I never questioned that for the first half of my career, but the second half of my career, I saw Guard units activated and sent into situations where I really had to wonder, why were they there? For that matter, why was the U.S. military there? But hearing the debate on both sides, quite frankly, Mr. President, I don't know how to vote on this. The good senator from 8 makes a very, very important point. Throughout my whole career, when orders came down, we saluted smartly and said, yes, sir, and off we went. There was no debate. There was no question that the Air National Guard wasn't going to go on Title 10 and support the national effort, whatever it might have been. And if there was a debate like that, well, you know, I don't see how our military can function that way. It's a matter of trust. You have to trust your chain of command, and when the orders come down, you simply carry them out. If you can't do that, then there's a problem with trust at the highest levels, and that's what I'm hearing here. There's a problem of trust, hence the legislation on the table today, up for debate. I think this legislation points directly at the fact that Congress, for whatever reason, hasn't functioned the way it should in accordance with the Constitution, and that leaves good, decent, God-fearing people with a question as to whether or not they can carry out their orders. And that's dangerous. That's very dangerous. So I wish I had a solution, Mr. President, but quite frankly, I'm stumped on this one. I likely will vote no, and that would be very reluctantly, but when we get the call, we have to go. If there are problems over and above the operative level, i.e. Congress, then we need to deal directly with those problems without compromising the chain of command. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. Is there further debate?
Mr. President,
Senator Hart,
Debate in favor of the bill.
you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. When Congress debates an issue, each member of Congress represents a certain subset of the American people. So when Congress would debate whether or not they're going to declare war, that's a debate the American people are going to have. I think that's what the Founding Fathers wanted. And when that debate takes place, certain facts will be uncovered, myths will be dispelled. We should have an honest debate with all the information on the table. I think Senate Bill 1252 encourages that kind of debate. I think this is what the Founding Fathers wanted. I think they wanted the American people to weigh in with Congress and to support Congress if there was a declaration of war. A debate will help that process happen. I think this is a good bill. I'm going to vote for it.
Is there further debate?
Mr. President, my microphone just broke.
You should turn the mic off, adjust it, then turn it back on.
Sorry about that, Mr. President.
Senator Lenny, you recognize the debate.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, the last time the United States Congress declared war, as was already mentioned, was 1942. That was 81 years ago, was the last real war we had. Since then, I know there have been minor political, little military skirmishes here and there, but the big ones being Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. What did they all have in common? You could argue that we had no business being there politically, but one thing they definitely had in common is that none of these military conflicts were constitutional. I appreciate the senator from District 8's testimony and sharing that with us, and this isn't an easy thing, and he did rightly say that this bill's looking backward, but we need to be looking forward. Well, looking at the news and reading everything I'm reading, looking forward, I think if the war machine has their way, looking forward appropriately, what's next? Ukraine? Are we going to send our troops over to Ukraine in an unconstitutional war? You know, I'm 44 years old, and my entire life we've been involved in these unconstitutional wars. And I, for one, am sick of the United States being used as the world police. I'm tired of the endless wars. I'm tired of intervening in civil wars in countries where neither side wants us there. I think this is a really good bill. It's long past due, and I want to commend the senator from District 12 for bringing it forward. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Is there further debate?
Mr. President.
Senator Winder.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's been an interesting process we've gone through as we consider this bill. Being a veteran myself, serving during Vietnam, I look back over my lifetime. I was the youngest of 7. My 2 older brothers, one served at the end of World War II, one served during Korea, and I had the privilege of serving during Vietnam. So what does that tell you? My whole lifetime, we've been at war in our country. One way or another, we've been at war. World War II, we had the hearts and minds of the whole country behind us. Vietnam, that wasn't the case. They told us not to wear our uniforms when we go home. Why? Because we'd be disrespected. Korean War, they didn't even get a national monument for many, many years. It was called the Forgotten War. Why? There was no declaration of war. Our culture wasn't behind it. Our citizens weren't behind it. They drafted us, said you go fight, but the culture wasn't behind it. When we have 9/11, it's the first time the country really came together in a long, long time. But what did they do? They just passed an act saying you can authorize military action. Why is that different? There was no national enemy. The enemy was throughout the world, different places throughout the Middle East, South America, lots of different places. So maybe that's an exception. But I remember when we started this and saying to my wife, this is going to be a 100-year war like this. 100 years of war. That's what it might take to deal with all this. And yet we still don't have an act of war. We don't have a declaration of war. And yet, these terrorists are being hidden and covered and protected and funded by national governments. It's not any different than World War I or World War II. But we've chosen as a culture to kind of ignore it. Take the easy way. And I hope you will support this bill, even though I know it does create conflict. I know that it creates conflict for maybe people that have served in the Guard. I didn't serve in the Guard. I served active duty. But a vote for this bill is not in disrespect for our National Guard or for the men and women that have served. You've served with honor. You've served with the best possible purpose. You followed your orders and you did them well, and we're proud of you. And this isn't about you or the duty or the performance. This is about a bigger issue, and it's about how do you get a culture, how do you get a Congress to actually have the guts to stand up and not just point at the military and say, well, the military failed. Soldiers failed. We haven't had that kind of commitment in this country since World War II. And yet we've lost thousands and thousands of our best. Thank you, Mr. President.
Is there further debate?
Mr. President.
Senator Ward Ingle King.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, getting the Congress to do a declaration of war is way above my pay grade. But I do have a grandson at the Air Force Academy, and should a conflict occur that is, you know, something I don't want to see, but I want him to know he can count on a well-trained Idaho National Guard, so I can't support this bill.
Is there further debate?
Mr. President.
Senator Nichols.
Thank you, Mr. President, to debate the bill.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. President. There's been a lot of good debate, Senators, and I appreciate the discussion on this. And I have not served in the military myself, but I have family members that have, and really appreciate what they have sacrificed on our behalfs. So when Congress will not perform their duty with the power that we have loaned to them, then it is the duty of the state to interpose and protect their own militia. Looking forward, we must stop the ongoing and future abuse of our military with a runaway foreign policy. And I agree, all the things that the good senator from District 8 said, those are important things, and they are worthy of a congressional declaration of war. Congress's name on the line is the minimum standard that we should require before our soldiers put their boots on the ground and sacrifice their lives. We must trust that our representatives will honor the Constitution, and we decide these things in civilian government so that the uniformed men and women don't have to question. Wise and prudent civilian oversight of the military is the most solemn duty of elected representatives. The hard debate is the chambers of government. And when our federal government is not doing their job like they're doing in so many other areas, then it is up to the states to be able to utilize our sovereignty and the powers that we hold to be able to do that which is right and to follow and abide by our Constitution and what has been set out for us. Mr. President, I would like to read a quote by Merriam-Webster, if I could.
Is that the dictionary guy?
It is the dictionary guy.
You have permission to read from the dictionary.
Thank you, Mr. President. So Merriam-Webster, he was one of the finest statesmen of our nation, and in his career he served as both a U.S. congressman, a senator, and the Secretary of State to 3 presidents. And this is what he said: "The operation of measures thus unconstitutional and illegal ought to be prevented by a resort to other measures which are both constitutional and legal. It will be the solemn duty of the state governments to protect their own authority over their own militia, and to interpose between their citizens an arbitrary power by the federal government. These are among the objects for which the state government exists." So for decades, the federal government has sought to use our National Guard as a tool to fight undeclared wars in violation of the federal law, and SB 1252 will hold the federal government accountable and end this unconstitutional practice. And with that, I will be voting in support of this bill. Thank you, Mr.
Is there further debate? Hearing none? Senator Adams, you're recognized to stand and close the debate.
Thank you, Mr. President. I did write down all the districts of all the folks who testified, and I appreciate all the testimony. This discussion needs to happen. It's healthy. I wanted to address a couple of the things that were brought up. First off, that somehow, by the passage of this legislation, we would no longer be allowed to train. Title 32, which this legislation does not touch at all, is state orders training. Title 10 is active duty combat. Now, when you get called up, you might get Title 10 orders. That is, as the senator from District 8 brought up, the 1933 National Defense Act. That law was passed for uniformity. For uniformity. To make sure that the lieutenant in the Idaho National Guard is the same rank structure as over here and that everybody's getting trained. So when we do get called up through a declaration of war, that we all know what to call each other. We all know the pecking order. So I want to know what bureaucrat is saying that we're going to somehow be defunded. Something I really, when we're trying to fix a problem, you got to have a strategy. Hope is not a strategy. We have to take action. And this is action. You know, we fight federal bureaucracy on behalf of our citizens every day. We fight over water, we fight over land, we fight over grizzly bears and wolves. Surely we will fight over the very lives of our service members here in the National Guard and for our Constitution, which is clear. Which is clear. If you were to ask the average person, average citizen in Idaho, where American political power lies, most of them would say Congress or Washington, more accurately. But governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, or so our Declaration of Independence says. We are the governed. And passing this legislation into law, and through this chamber, sends a clear message that we do not, on behalf of our citizens and the generations that will follow, consent to putting lives on the line until Congress first puts their political necks on the line. If it's worth dying for, it should be worth voting for. Nothing in this legislation limits our National Guard's ability to be called up through a declaration of war or for peacetime training. And if the courts want to challenge it or the DOD wants to challenge it, then let's have that discussion. But it only happens if we take the action. Thank you, Mr. President. Debate is closed.
The debate is closed. The question before the Senate is, shall Senate Bill 1252 pass the Senate? The Secretary will call the roll.
Adams. Anthony. Berndt.
60 seconds.
Senator Berndt, you have 60 seconds to explain your vote.
Thank you, Mr. President. The emotion in this chamber is palpable. We can all feel it, and I echo the words from our good pro tem in District 20, who mentioned that his vote would not, was out of respect for those who have served and who are serving, who will serve in the Air National Guard in our great state, and I echo his words in his testimony as well. And with that, Mr. President, I will be voting aye. The Senator votes aye.
Senator Berndt votes yes. Aye.
Bierke. Burtonshaw. Carlson. Cook. Den Hartog. Foreman. Grow. Guthrie. Harris. Hart. Hartkin. Herndon. Just. Lakey. Lee. Lenny. Lend. Nichols. Okonowitz. Robbie. Ricks. Ruckty. Schroeder. Semmelroth. Taylor. Taves. Trakel. Van Orden. Wardingle-King. Winder. Wintrow. Seiderveld.
Senator Seiderfeld, you have 60 seconds to explain your vote.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to speak as a daughter, a granddaughter, an aunt, and a mother of veterans. My family has served in every single war I believe this country has seen. And it's difficult watching your loved ones go off, get on that bus, get on that ship, and getting a Zoom call, and then them, all of a sudden leaving their Connex building because they were getting bombed. It's difficult watching all of that as a loved one. I think that we should do everything we possibly can to make sure that we're sending them there constitutionally. They are giving their lives for us. There's no greater love than one who will give their life for another. I think that constitutionally we should do everything that we can, that when we send them there, we are considering the cost and make sure we're doing it constitutionally. And to every single one of...
How do you vote?
I vote yes, and can I just say thank you for all your service.
You did. Senator Seiderfeld votes yes.
Anthony. Burtonshaw. Lakey. Lent. Robbie. Ruckty.
Mr. President, 60 seconds.
Senator Rutke, you have 60 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I think the reason that we're all having, at least some of us, a tough time with this vote is because it's actually the wrong debate. I think the real debate is what role we feel the United States should play around the world, and this just becomes a placeholder for that debate. Are we going to be isolationist, or are we going to be the defender of democracy that we have since World War II? It's not a coincidence that it was since World War II that we became a world power, and that the last time we declared war was in World War II. For that reason, I'll be voting no. Thank you.
Senator Rutke votes no.
Samaroff? Taylor?
The vote count shows 27 in favor with 8 against, a majority having voted in the affirmative. Senate Bill 1252 has passed the Senate. Hearing no correction to the title is approved, and the bill will be transmitted to the House.